So one of the greatest spiritual concerns that an awful lot of people have is something like this. What if I were to do something that was just too bad, or maybe to do too many bad things for God to forgive me? Well, here's the short answer, and I want you to know that it's good news. You can never out-sin God's grace. In Romans 5:20, the Apostle Paul wrote this: "The law was brought in so that the trespass might increase, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more." What Paul means is that when the law was given, it highlighted just how much wrong people did. It may have seemed like they did more wrong things, but that wasn't really true. They were just more aware of the wrong they did. And we have that same experience when we become aware of God's law. We start to realize how much we sin. But there's also the promise here, and the promise is that where sin increases, God's grace increases all the more. God's grace will never be outpaced by our sin. And so he's never going to run out of grace for us, no matter how much we sin. But that's not all. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, God also said this to the Apostle Paul. God said, "My grace is sufficient for you." And in Greek, the original language of the New Testament, that word sufficient, archeo, it means to possess unfailing strength. So God's grace, not only does it never run out, it is powerful. It is strong enough to handle even the worst sins. So there is no sin under heaven which is too great, too bad to be forgiven. And I want us to remember who it is that wrote both of these verses. It was the Apostle Paul, a man who before he came to faith was persecuting the church. Paul was literally going around and having Christians put to death and thrown in jail. And he only stopped when he had a spiritual experience with Jesus on the Damascus road. And Jesus kind of yelled at him and said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And so it's for this reason that Paul considers himself, he says in the scripture, the worst of sinners. And he was right. He was the worst. He was the worst because he did all of these terrible things, not just to people, but to the church, which is Jesus' body. And that's the reason on the Damascus road that Jesus says to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" So Paul, the worst of sinners, came to know in his heart of hearts that he had grace, that he was truly forgiven. And so he wrote in Ephesians 2:8, "It is by grace that we have been saved." So no matter how bad you may think you are, I want you to confront the fact that you are not as bad as Paul. You just aren't, and you never will be. And if God's grace was sufficient for Paul, God's grace is sufficient for you. So all of us should seek to do our best not to sin, but when we do, we should honestly seek God's forgiveness and then be at peace, knowing that we have grace.